IIA, which we successfully managed to do. To be honest, in the process itself, so during the political negotiations between the institutions, it was quite challenging to be heard and to have an impact on the discussion that were going on. There was a consultation in December 2020, but in all honesty, this was already after the main political decisions had been taken, so our role in that have been more limited. In the implementation, however, so after there was a political agreement, the Secretariat worked on implementing guidelines. There we've been involved in the consultation, and also leading up to the entry into force of the new register, we've been in regular contact with the Secretariat to make sure that all the information, relevant information for our members would be clear and would get to them before the entry into force of the new register.
Do you sense any flaws in how the new system operates at all?
So overall, I think EPACA is quite happy with the EU Transparency Register. I'm sure that María Rosa can say a bit more about that, but especially when comparing with other political systems, it's quite an advanced register. Of course, we also think that the creation of the new IIA on the mandatory transparency register was a step in the right direction. I think some of the conditionality measures have gone further. For instance, EPACA was in favor of all MEPs to only meet with registered lobbyists, while now it's only certain MEPs who are involved in policy making processes. So that's, I think, one step that it could still improve, is to include more of these conditionality measures. One issue we also had leading up to the implementation was the scope and the definition of covered activities. And we had this is quite a technical issue, but we were informed in the process that monitoring activities would not be seen as a covered activity of the register. And for our members, that's quite important, because the services we provide to our clients, it's a package deal, and monitoring is part of that package. So to exclude that from the register and also exclude all the financial information related to monitoring services, that was a bit of an issue. So this is one of the examples, I think, where a more intense dialogue between the Secretariat and the sector could have helped to avoid these kinds of issues. But in the end, we found a solution. We found an interpretation that worked for the sector and for the Secretariat. And I think another area of improvement would be enforcement, and not per se on the side of the lobbyists, because I think if as a lobbyist you don't comply with the code of conduct, or your information in the transparency register is not appropriate or not correct, this can lead to suspension from the register or even removal from the register, and can also lead to reputational damage, because the Secretariat can also publish this information. On the other hand, for us, from the side of the industry, it's very difficult to see how the register is being monitored and checked from the policymaker. Next to the register, there's also the obligation for certain policymakers within the EU institutions to publish their meetings. This is also a way to see, okay, are these people indeed meeting with registered lobbyists? And from our perspective, it's very difficult to see how this is being monitored or controlled or even enforced. So that's something, I think, where the European system could still improve.
Thank you very much indeed for that, Matti. If I could go to Maria, please, for your reflections on why those changes were necessary. Please speak about the extent to which you were consulted and involved, and any flaws that you might identify.
Yes, well, the Public First Community of Europe gathers National Association of Lobbyists. So we represent the lobbyists that operate at member state levels. So it would be we would represent the British Lobbyist Association if they wanted, which is not the case at the moment. So we represent the voices of lobbyists in the different national realities. As Matti said, we indeed portray the European Union transparency regime as a very good example, because in our opinion, it does set a balanced set of rules, both for lobbyists and for public officials, And the balance is very important in these cases, because normally countries do tend to impose obligation on lobbyists and forget about themselves. But we also need to understand that the European Union itself, it's not a constitutional regime such as national realities are. So at member state levels, there are many considerations that you should include in your thinking. When you are regulating lobbying, you often have to touch on fundamental rights, like access to information, like participation in the decision-making process, and more recently, even freedom of speech and freedom of media. And this is something that you have to tackle. But nevertheless, and coming back to the question, yes, the European Union, especially because its review, it's ongoing, and its improvements are always, on the go, and it's constantly adapting to the realities of lobbying in the European Union, is a good balanced framework. I do, however, want to draw your attention also to the work that the OECD does at this respect, and that is very useful guidelines for governments wishing to regulate lobbying.
Thank you very much indeed. I wonder, just a quick question. Is registration obligatory? Either of our witnesses want to answer that.
So in the EU Transparency Register, it's not obligatory, so it's voluntary by nature. But so the philosophy behind the IIA on a mandatory transparency register was to make it de facto mandatory. What they mean by this is that if you want to be a proper public affairs consultant in Brussels, in the EU, you need to be on the register, because it allows you to have meetings with commissioners, with cabinet members of commissioners. It allows you to request an access badge to the European Parliament. So there's no law, there's no regulation, there's no directive obliging lobbyists or interest representatives to register, but they created a system where your life as a lobbyist becomes much easier if you are on the register.
That's very helpful. And on that theme, I'll go to my colleague, please, Damien Moore.
Thank you, Chairman. Is lobbying in Brussels conducted only by firms or organisations who are registered? And if not, do you have any estimate of the amount being conducted by those who are not registered?
Thank you for your question. It's of course a difficult question to answer, because one of the reasons why people are in favor of a register is to be able to measure this, to be able to measure lobbying activity. So if you're not on the register, it's also difficult to measure. Now, from my own experience, it's very rare to come across, especially consultancies or companies that are serious about their public affairs activities and are not on the register. It's even so that at some point there were actually too many organizations in the register because companies started to see it as a stamp of approval. If you're in the register, you're a recognized lobbyist. It was a way to kind of showcase their activity in Brussels. And the Secretariat actually started to be more strict with eligibility for registration. And so you'll see that the past couple of years, actually, the number of registrants has gone down. And this is because the Secretariat has been actively removing organizations from the register who do not meet the eligibility criteria to be on the register. So there is a strong, there was and there is still a very strong willingness within the sector, within the industry, to be on the register.
Maria, have you got anything to say on that?
Yeah, I wanted this is something for Matti to confirm, but I remember that American law firms tended to be like more elusive of the registering obligations and still did a lot of lobbying. Is that still the case? Perhaps you could.
So on law firms, so this was a discussion in the very early stages of the transparency register that was important. So who should register and who should not? What the IIA does now is it defines interest representation activities. And so what falls or what is considered a covered activity. And the entity or the organization performing it doesn't really matter. So if your objective is to influence EU policymaking or EU legislation, and you're using legal arguments or PR campaigns or position papers or coalition, you are de facto, you are an interest representative and you are lobbying, so you should be on the register. What they have provided is some exceptions, and one of these exceptions is, for instance, if you're a lawyer and you're hired by an MEP to offer that MEP personal legal advice on his or her divorce, let's say, it's just an example. Of course, you do not need to be on the register in order to be able to perform that activity. So that's how they handled that situation.
So you would say that the loophole with law firms has been rectified, or do you think there's more work to be done on there?
From a rulemaking point of view, I think they've indeed rectified that loophole. Whether the change has also been seen on the ground, that I'm not 100% sure about. I think it would still be possible as a law firm to sell your services as legal advice rather than public affairs advice or lobbying advice. But then again, we come back to the enforcement issue. So it's right now purely based on a complaints procedure, or mostly based on a complaints procedure, and also very depending on the role of a transparency watchdog, such as Transparency International, for instance.
So there's still a lot of open interpretation then, depending on how they see they're giving that advice.
I mean, I must say that in the guidelines itself, it's specified quite clearly what is considered covered activities and what is not. But of course, yeah, there's always some gray area that can be misused. I would say so.
Thank you, Maria. Have you got anything to say on that? No. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you very much, Damien. Beth Winter, please.
Chair. Are organisations based outside the EU required to register, and are you confident that they do so? Ms. Rosa Rotondo, do you want to answer that one, please?
Can you please repeat?
Are organisations outside of the EU required to register, and if so, how confident are you that they do that?
Organizations are outside the EU.
We're based outside.
Anyone, as Matti said, anyone, of course, with some gray areas at some in some cases, everyone that does try to influence or influences in Brussels is registering effectively. Across Europe, the creation of lobbyist register is not so much developed. Actually, there are only a few countries. There are only 7 European countries with some kind of regulation. In all of these 7 European countries that have regulated, there are registers of some kind, and in some cases, some are voluntary and some are mandatory, with mandatory registers only basically in France and Germany. Therefore, the reality in the national, at national level in countries of Europe is very varied, because this is not subject to European legislation or harmonization. This is not transparency per se at national members, is not in the treaties, and therefore the European Union cannot promote legislation. Therefore, we find a heterogeneous situation, very, very heterogeneous, because this is largely a national issue. And for this reason, I mean, even if the countries where it has been regulated is, some of them are very important, like Germany and France, the situation is really very different from country to country.
Van Hecke, anything to add?
No, I think Maria Rosa is correct. So it's important to remember that indeed it's not a mandatory register. So it's you are not required to register per se. Of course, indeed, also companies outside of the EU would be expected to do so. But in the end, I think, and this is why I think also the EU Transparency Register is popular, from a purely cost-benefit kind of calculation and analysis, it's more interesting to be on the register.
Mr. Van Hecke, could I also ask you what information you are required to disclose into the register, and is that information all relevant to the activities that you carry out, please? Yeah.
So it's quite a lot of information, but a lot of the information is related to the organization itself. And so who is the legal representative, what is the staff size, what is the address, etc. So quite objective, neutral information. Then it's also asked to provide information on the legislative files you are following, and this can be anything. This can be regulations, directives, on initiative reports, etc. Then they also ask you to provide information on interest representation activities you are conducting on these files, and this can be communication campaigns, this can be coalition building initiatives, so it's quite a broad description.
Do you think it's relevant information and it's sufficient, the information that's gathered?
That's a difficult question. I think it's relevant. The challenge that my members, of course, face, and this is very much an EPACA issue, is that we have some member consultancies which are quite large. And let's say we have a consultancy, we have member consultancies that have 50, maybe 100 clients. For each client, there's, let's say, 8 or 10 legislative files that is relevant to follow. So for a consultancy to provide information on all these files and everything we're doing on, that's quite challenging. And to my own experience, what is being done with this information is not always proportionate to the intensity it requires for us and our members to collect that information. But then again, we're very committed to transparency. We really don't believe we have anything to hide, so we're happy to do this. But in my fair assessment, and this is supported by our members, or at least the members of our management committee, there is a growing feeling that the information that is being requested is not always per se proportionate to what is being done with that information, because there's no issue with being transparent, but it's always interesting to know, okay, how does this extra information contribute to transparency, enhance transparency?
Thank you. Anything you wanted to add on that, Ms. Rotondo?
Can I maybe, if I can just add one, because there's one very important, what we also have to disclose, of course, is our clients. Mm-hmm. So consultancies have to disclose their clients, companies have to disclose their consultants, and also the associated costs and revenues. And an important change since the most recent update is that consultancies have to declare their revenues per client, clients have to declare their costs per consultancy, and of course this has to make sense. So this was an important recent change, which again also has added a level of coordination that is required between clients and their consultants and intermediaries. So that's, this is something that was added recently.
Thank you. Ms. Rotondo, anything to add?
Yes, thank you very much. Yes, normally registers require indeed a number of things which are useful to identify the organization lobbying behind and to prevent undue influence and covert influence, and that's fine, and that's what the register should be. But Matti was just mentioning the fact that most lobbying registers require a certain financial disclosure on the side, especially of consultancies, and then on the side of companies. We think that this is very relevant in terms of following the money, so to speak, but it is really not so important. There are incredibly efficient and almost cost-free campaigns that have been done in the past. We have several examples in Spain, some examples in the UK. So from our perspective, while supporting transparency, as Matti was saying, we have to really think about what is really efficient for the purpose of the register. And oftentimes money and financial disclosures rely on consultancies, tend to punish consultancies, and are not so efficient for the purposes of following the correlation between money and influence, which is something that we can discuss. It's not a direct correlation.
Okay, thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much indeed. John MacDonald, please.
Can we ask you some questions about the Code of Conduct, which is a requirement for registration as well? 3 questions basically. How comprehensive is it? Is it routinely complied with? How is compliance monitored? And then what happens if there are found to be breaches in the Code of Conduct? What are the consequences for that? Matti, can I start with you?
Yes, of course. Thank you for your question. So in my fair assessment, the Code of Conduct is quite standard, I would say. I think if you just behave as a responsible, ethical interest representatives, you're not really in risk of breaching it unknowingly. So what the Code of Conduct specifies, for instance, is that you should always be transparent about the interest representative that you, or the interest that you represent, whether it's for a client, which company you work for, to not use misleading information, to fill in the register with accurate data. So if you're acting as a proper, responsible interest representative, I don't think there's anything in there that could surprise you in, oh, I've breached the code accidentally. How is compliance monitored? So there's a secretary that, of course, checks the information that is uploaded in the register. They even have some automatic software that detects inconsistency. So if your revenue would not come in or not be as logically associated with your staff size, for instance, this software system would detect that. And next to that, there's a complaints procedure. So if anyone could be a policymaker, could be a journalist, could be a competitor, for instance, notices something that is in breach under the Code of Conduct, they can start a complaints procedure also at the Secretariat. If there's a breach, the Secretariat can decide to set up an investigation procedure. This entire procedure is laid out in Annex 3 of the IIA, but ultimately it can lead to suspension or even removal from the register, which of course has important implications for consultancies such as our members, because on the one hand, you're not really able to fully perform your interest representation activities. And secondly, there's of course reputational damage that is linked to being removed from the register. So these are, even though it's not a sanction or a penalty or a fee, it still has quite important operational and financial implications.
Maria, have you any comments on that?
Yeah, from my perspective, Code of Conducts are one of the things that can be more easily tweaked and adapted to the very specific national realities. For example, here in Spain, we have a principles-based Code of Conduct, which is self-regulation from our association. And this provides for a lot of room for countries to really make a code of conduct that is sufficient for the realities. I would, however, like to highlight that when regulating lobbying, it is very important to trust the supervision and sanctions. Definitely, you have to have sanctions on an independent authority. So this is perhaps not so obvious, but in Spain we have some issues with this at the moment with some legislation in process. The regulation, the authority implementing the Code of Conduct and in general all the obligations associated with the register has to be independent and be, from both the government or the Parliament and the lobbyist.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Karen Smith, please.
Thank you. If we can move to the issue of sanctions now briefly. There are currently no fines or legal sanctions to ensure lobbyists comply with registration requirements. In your experience, should there be? And how proactively is that monitored? Mr. Van Hecke, do you want to go first?
Sure. So indeed, there is an investigation. There is a complaints procedure. There's not a possibility right now to give penalties or sanctions, but again, being suspended or being removed from the register, that combined with the reputational damage it could cause, would still have very severe and strong implications for the industry. So even though there's not a possibility to to sanction with a financial penalty, I still think that the enforcement is quite on the side of the lobbyist, on the side of the interest representative, is quite strong in the EU system.
Do you want to expand on that a little bit for us?
Sure. I mean, one of the conditionality measures that are in place is that certain decision makers can only meet with registered lobbyists. If you want to be part of an expert group in the European Commission, you have to be on the register. If you want to request an EP badge to access the European Parliament, you have to be on the register. If you're removed from the register, yeah, all those benefits, of course, are no longer possible to you, which would hamper you in your operations. And then again, it would be published on the website. You would have NGO watchdogs such as Transparency International or Politico having headlines on company X has been removed of the register due to breach of transparency regulations. Yeah, that would not benefit their business. So there's a very strong, of course, there's an ethical conviction, but there's also a very strong operational incentive to comply with the code of conduct and to comply with the provisions of the transparency register from the perspective of the industry representative.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Rotondo?
Nothing to add. I think Matti explained it sufficiently. The reputational damage, our business is based on reputation as lobbyists, and the reputational damage is oftentimes, good enough. We are not against financial sanctions or these kind of things, as we think that enforcement is very important, but nothing else to
And
add.
what about the monitoring of disclosures for accuracy and completeness? Do you feel that's done sufficiently?
Yes. So if I'm basing myself on the questions I get out from my members or the emails, so yes. So Transparency International is also on the transparency register, and I heard from them that they also get control. So maybe Vitor can add to that later. But so yes, so controls are rather proactive and quite regular. And basically it means that they can ask questions if they see certain irregularities or inconsistencies. They ask us questions and we just reply and provide them with information. And until now, that has been sufficient. So I have no knowledge of within the membership of EPACA to any investigative procedures have been started.
Russell Moore, I think he has a supplementary question.
You mentioned Transparency International a number of times. They tell us that in 2019, only about 50% of the 4,600 spot checks that they did were fully accurate on the register. Is that them being over pernickety, or is it that there is a systemic problem there that 50% of the 4,000 odd that they checked weren't accurate?
I think that, of course, Transparency International and Vitor is the best person to answer that question. The role we've played as EPACA is, of course, to still inform our members on how to fill in the transparency register. It's not that easy, and so there's differences in what you have to fill in when you're a consultancy, when you're an in-house lobbyist, or when you're an NGO. There's financial information that is requested that can be based on financial years. There's questions about, okay, what happens if you have multiple, if you're a multinational and you have different offices, you have one in Brussels and you have one there, or what happens if you're for instance, lobbying, the Czech minister in Prague. Is that an activity that is covered by the EU Transparency Register? Is that a national activity? So I'm not denying that there might be some flaws or irregularities in the register, but it's also because it's quite complex also for registrants to understand exactly how to fill in and what to do in some of the issues or some of the questions I just asked. So one of the important missions of EPACA is to provide this dialogue between registrants and the Secretariat to make sure that everyone's on the same page in terms of expectations on how to fill in the register.
So your perception of that 50% is that it is probably technical complications in terms of filling in the form rather than deliberate manipulations?
Based on my own experience, yes. I've not come across, you have to be, in order to become a member of EPACA, you have to be on the transparency register, but I have not come across organizations that would deliberately not give accurate information, because then again, you can also not be on the register. So why be on the register and risk giving inaccurate information that then can lead to investigative procedures, etc. So that would indeed be my conclusion.
Okay, so I should interrupt you, Karen Smith.
The conditionality principle should mean that access to policymakers for those firms is prevented or at least curtailed. How effective do you think that's proved in practice? Mr. Rotondo, do you want to go first?
Did you say my name? Apologies.
Fine. If you could go ahead.
Go ahead, Matti.
Okay. So your question is whether on how effective conditionality is. So, of course, it's one of the big reasons why people want to be on the register is to be able to have these meetings, and to be also, especially from the consultant perspective, yeah, if you're in the pitch and you're not on the register, yeah, you have a competitive disadvantage to the other consultancy that is also pitching. So I think it has a strong effect. I think it could still be broadened. So as said before, I think every MEP should only meet with registered lobbyists. I think also in the council, and I know Transparency International and Vito has a very strong opinion on that. Right now, it's only the presidency that only meets registered lobbyists, but it's a bit bizarre because decisions are taken by 26. So I think it's important, and I think it's really leading to more and more organizations want to be on the register. Is it impossible to have meetings with decision makers if you're not on the register? No, but that means that you also have to regulate the private life or spontaneous meetings between people or phone calls, and that's something that is of course incredibly difficult to do. But it would mean that you have to operate off the grid, that you have to operate in the shadows. And based on my own perception of the industry that I'm working in, it's not the optimal way to do public affairs.
We've just sorry to interrupt. We've had our own issues with WhatsApp, for example. But so can you just how is compliance monitored then?
So there is, if I would have to check to be sure. But so right now. The rule to only meet with registered lobbyists only applies to meetings taking place in the EU institutions or on the EU institution premises. Also, the publication of meetings is related to meetings taking place on the premises of the EU institution. So it doesn't regulate all meetings that could happen or all communication forms between an interest representative and a policymaker. Actually, sorry, this is just coming to me now. There was a big discussion, or there was a sort of an issue during the COVID crisis, because of course, physical meetings were becoming very uncommon. And then the Secretary did issue a statement that a video meeting would be considered as a personal meeting. So video meetings are now also considered a meeting. So the Transparency Register only covers meetings, rather official meetings taking place between interest representatives and policymakers, but not all forms of communication.
Thank you.
If I may add, this is very much connected to the definition of lobbying that you include in your legislation. So, for example, we advocate for a broad definition of lobbying that includes not only meetings, which are of course important, but also events, PR work, campaigning, also campaigning in social media. And actually, the outcome of a broad definition of lobbying results in the fact that if I engage with an MP or an official via WhatsApp or Twitter, or I find him or her in the corridor or on the street, I should behave equally, responsibly, and according to my own set of rules and code of ethics. So a broad definition of lobbying and a broad definition of lobbyists with a mandatory registry should actually cover this kind of activities which of course are they difficult to monitor and regulate. As we always say, the fact that, killing is forbidden and is subject to strong sanction doesn't avoid entirely criminal activity. So let's focus on what we really want to be effective. And on the conditionality question, let's not forget that lobbying is not mandatory in the European Union because of the absence because of the treaty issue. However, we always say it is a false voluntary regime because it is apparently voluntary, but there's nothing you can do if you are not registered. In countries where we do not have this limitation, registration has to be mandatory and universal, meaning that's no exceptions and obligation to register instead of leaving it to the volunteer of the people.
Very clear. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Final questions for this panel from John MacDonald, please.
This is your chance to lobby us. Okay. What if any, are there any parts of the European system for regulating we should be looking at to adopt in the United Kingdom? Matti and then Rosa.
Yeah, thank you for your question. I think a couple of them have already come up. Very recently mentioned by María Rosa. A broad definition is extremely important, and also a definition that defines the activity rather than the organization or the type of person conducting the activity, to really have a non-discriminatory approach and to really cover all types of lobbying and all types of interest representation. I think that's one of the very important lessons I think we have taken from our experience with the EU Transparency Register. Secondly, indeed, create incentives that are linked to registration and make registration a positive thing, make transparency a positive thing, ensure that people want to be on the Transparency Register. It's a system that seems to be working, that even worked too much. Too many people wanted to be on the register. So I think that also creates a good atmosphere. The third one might seem a bit obvious, but it's digitalize your registration form and automate your processes where possible. And the reason why I say this is because I also have some experience with the Belgian Lobby Transparency Register, and this is just a PDF form that is being updated very irregularly. So again, I think the system we have in the EU is quite advanced. There's automatic links between the registrant and the publications or submissions that organization has done for consultations or the list of meetings that it has had. So digitalizing this and automating it where possible, also gives it kind of a state-of-the-art feel that people want to be part of. So that's a very important one. And then my last one, obviously, would be to involve representatives, NGOs, but also industry representatives in the development, but also the implementation of the regime to avoid any implementation issues that might occur.
Maria, final words from you.
Yeah, I would just add on everything that Matti has said. I'm a mandatory registered and I would add, for a good transparency regime, publication of agendas of public officials. This is a very easy tool to introduce transparency. It's also very cost effective. Of course, the sanctions, the independent authority that supervises both sides of the relationship. A very clear regulation on revolving doors that avoids conflicts of interest, but it's still able to attract good professionals to policy making, and very importantly, the legislative footprint, some kind of footprint of the lobbying action or the participation action, because not everything is lobbying, of the participation action in a certain rule. And then if you want to really move forward and align the regulation in your country with one which is really 21st century, then you have to define things like undue influence, covert influence, and also and this is why I was referring to the OECD work on this regard. And you may also have to have a look at social media and media transparency to see who is behind certain campaigning that goes on fundamentally in the online world or in the PR and media work. But this touches, of course, on very sensitive issues. I'm not saying it's easy. I'm just answering to your question. This is effective.
That's really helpful. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. Can I thank both the witnesses from our first panel for giving their time and expertise to the committee. We're all very grateful indeed. You're welcome to remain on the call if you wish to listen to our second panel. But for the moment, thank you both very much indeed, which moves us seamlessly on by means of modern technology to our second panellist, Vitor Teixeira, who is Senior Policy Officer at Transparency International EU. And we have questions beginning from me. Good morning, Vitor.
Good morning. Thank you for the invitation.
Pleasure. Right. So, how confident are you that all those who should be registered to lobby at European level are registered, or is lobbying being conducted by those outside of that register?
Thank you for the question. I would say I'm not confident, or fairly confident. So it is true, as Matti had mentioned, that that the register is voluntary. But because of all of the conditions, so we cannot be guaranteed that everyone that is lobbying is registered. Having said that, because of the conditionalities that are in place, and because it is so much easier to conduct your advocacy or lobby work if you are registered, to a high degree, I would expect most of lobbyists to be registered, because otherwise so many doors are just closed to you. Senior officials of the Commission, you would not be able to enter the European Parliament. And as Matti mentioned already, as even with now, since COVID, with the increase of online meetings, the Commission still takes this as a lobby or advocacy meeting, so you would still have to be registered. But ultimately, the system is voluntary. You don't have to be registered if you don't want to, if you believe that it is best for you not to be registered, because if you're not registered, for example, then you don't have to follow a code of conduct, for example. But I would expect the great majority to be registered.
Okay, but if lobbying is being conducted outside of the register, how or indeed is it possible for that to be permitted under the scheme?
So I have to explain that lobbying, I will take the definition, which is any activity with the intention to influence decision making or policy making and the policy makers. Taking that definition, the interinstitutional agreement at European level sees that some entities are not covered by this, by the register. So public authorities of member states would not be registered, although they, of course, in their meetings, they might have an interest. Associations or networks of authorities, intergovernmental organizations, political parties, churches or religious associations, they fall outside of the register. But on the other side, if they would have an office representing their interests, this office would have to be registered. So the current scheme sees that does allow for certain exceptions.
Okay. That's very helpful. Thank you for that. And my colleague Tom Randall, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Vitor, could you tell us how big a concern is lobbying by firms based outside of the EU? And are they required to register? And if so, how is this enforced?
Thank you. So I should say a priori that that I will have a slightly different view on some of the issues than the previous speakers. We do work very often with the EPACA and other lobbyists in Brussels. Having said that, our view is rather systemic. They represent the interests of consultancies, but I should mention at this point that consultancies are only 5% of they get a lot of the attention, a lot of the spotlight, a lot of the scrutiny, but they are 5% of the organizations in the register. So if you look at the consultancies that have an interest, they do have an interest in being as transparent as possible, because it is it's a normalization of the profession, which is understandable. If you look at the other 13,000 registrants, because there are right now 13,600 registrants, the reply might be slightly different. So right now, out of these 13,600, 17% are based outside of the EU. But there must be the caveat that this is how they have been registered. But if you, in the system, how they registered themselves, for example, if you are representing the interests of, let's say, an American company, but you have a representation office legally based in Brussels, you might register yourself as being in Belgium, although ultimately you're representing interests from outside of the EU. So the 17% are covering only those that do mention that their physical office is based outside of the European Union.
Okay. The European register seems to require a lot more information to be disclosed than the UK one. Would you say that all that information is useful? Is it all useful? And is it all the information that you would actually want to be included in any such register?
So I have to say that our view on the transparency register is perhaps rather different from many other lobbyists. So myself, I am a lobbyist. I am pushing for a certain agenda, anti-corruption, pro-transparency agenda, still lobbying the policymakers. The transparency register is a tool for the protection of the policymaker. I am here today representing TIU and talking to you because someone has vetted that I am in fact representing Transparency International. And when I would have a meeting, if you would be responsible, if you would now be making writing a new piece of legislation that will impact millions of citizens, millions, perhaps millions of businesses, small, medium, or large, and I'm trying to influence that legislation, you need, as a policymaker, to have the information that will allow you to vet me as the person that I say I am and the interest that I say I defend. You would need to be able to see what has been our activities in the past, what has been our public positions on a certain topic. And this relates to the ability to confirm whether we are who we are and whether we are complying with the code of conduct, for example, in which I am not able to, I should not misrepresent my interests, or I should not be able to outright lie to policymakers, which if the code of conduct would not be there, I could. So considering that the transparency register is a protection for the policymaker to be able to make informed decisions, I would say that the information that is there is absolutely necessary for people to be able to assess the representative that is in front of them, and also to be able to put a face and be able to contact them if need be, so that you would know who is the person with the legal responsibility. If you would want to contact those people and you would want to have input from them, because you would like to, you would like to proactively reach out to them, that you have a contact that you're able to reach, that you are able to see all the information that you can. So yes, the information that is there is useful for you as policymakers. At the same time, is useful for other lobbyists that would like to also connect with others and be able to create broader networks, broader coalitions, to make their voice heard on legislations that will impact their business. Lobbying, I do understand, has very often very negative connotation, but everybody has the right to be heard on a piece of legislation that will impact their daily lives. Of course, transparency is not just the availability of information. If we just data dump, in a sense, information out there, it's not very useful. So all the information has to be in a way categorized, as it is in the Transparency Register in the European Union, and it has to be able to be available in a way that is user-friendly. Now, does it have every information that I would like it to have? No. There are many issues with the information as is. For example, let's say that a large organization that has a lot of resources, that is able to do advocacy at multiple levels. Right now, any advocacy or large part of the advocacy that would be conducting at the European level can be seen, but we have very often zero clue. As Matti pointed out, a very small number of countries have legislation on lobbying, but then if they are active at national level to influence decision making at European level, so the multiple level lobbying, it's not seen. So what, and this is the same, this is also true between a register at national level versus the regional lobbying that is being done at regional level to influence policymakers on legislation that will impact the entire country. So one thing that we would like to see on a register is a unique identifying number. So instead of having in each registry a different number, that you would have, each lobby organization would have one number that you can track across the local, regional, national, and supranational levels, so that you can truly see the lobbying or advocacy that they're conducting. And another thing that we would like to see is better connection between the information. So let's take the example of the consultancies. They have to declare their clients, how much each client pays, etc. The client needs to declare how many consultancies they have hired and so on. But they are not necessarily connected. So they have the obligation, if you would go to an entry of a consultancy, you would be able to see the clients, but then you have to research each client on its own. A simple link to the correct entry to which client it is described would make it a lot easier for a policymaker that's going through an entry to see exactly the connections between the different players or the different organizations in the register. And this is not true only for consultancies, this is true also for if they're members of an association, etc. So the connection between the different platforms, also a platform where all of the legislation is described. For example, at the European level, you have the Legislative Observatory of the European Union, of the European Parliament, where you can see who is the rapporteur, who are the shadows, when was the vote, which are the amendments, etc. This should be linked to the Transparency Register, and it is not. So I would say just better connection and better user-friendliness of the data would be very important.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. David Jones, please.
Yes, registration, of course, requires compliance with the Code of Conduct. How effective would you say this is ensuring that the that lobbying is conducted in a proper manner?
So I would say, Matti mentioned it before, the code of conduct is it's a standard. You could not be, as a lobbyist, you could not be surprised for behaving in a manner that is considered appropriate and ethical and be breaching the code. You should mention which interests you represent and who you are. You should not lie. You should not mislead policymakers, etc. So the code as is does set the limits and standards that one would expect. Then the question is, as it was mentioned, was in terms of monitoring and sanctioning. The best rule in the world, if it's not followed up when breach occurs, it's useless. So ultimately, it's about the level of monitoring you want to set in place and the resources that you want to set for that monitoring. And when I mean monitoring, I mean proactive monitoring, because right now the European level transparency register is extremely reactive. It's dependent on complaints by other registrants, so it puts the onus on other registrants to make sure that organizations that are also in the register are acting as ethically as all the other 13,000, and it should be up to the register itself to ensure that that the code of conduct is being followed.
So just to be clear, there is no proactive monitoring of compliance. Is that right?
Well, I cannot say there's absolutely none in terms of the code of conduct, but it is, from our perspective, is heavily reliant on complaints done by other registrants, as it was already mentioned. The Transparency Register, the Transparency International assessment. Although that assessment was not on the code of conduct, it was on the information being put on the Transparency Register. And on this point, so on the information that is being put on the Transparency Register, there is monitoring.
You mentioned also the issue of sanctions. What sanctions exist for non-compliance?
So if there is non-compliance, they might be removed from the register, or they would have their entry suspended for a period of time as long as there's the investigation. If there would be an actual sanction on a breach, it could go from 20 days to 2 years.
There are no criminal sanctions.
Well, it has to be seen that the problem also of the lack of fines is the legal basis, because the current Transparency Register is based on an interinstitutional agreement between the three main EU institutions. So the three institutions came together, agreed that they would follow put in place these rules that basically apply to themselves. So there are no criminal sanctions because of the way the legal basis is set.
And there are also no fines that could be imposed by any of these institutions, as I understand it. Do you think there should be?
Well, again, the legal basis does not allow for that. But we have been discussing at the European level that many times, and Transparency International, that when it comes to European legislation and legislation policy making, that many times the sanctions that are insufficient because they're very extreme. You either have no fines or you have a ban from the register. And there should be, if you would be setting up a system on lobbying, there should be in between sanctions for the different types of breaches that there would be.
The conditionality principle would appear to mean that access to policymakers for representatives of firms that are not registered is prevented or at least significantly curtailed. In practice, how effective has this proved?
I would say it has shown to be a good step by the European institutions. So when the no registration, no meeting occurred, the decision taken by the European Commission that if you're not registered, you cannot meet commissioners, cabinet members, and director general, so the senior level. At the time, so when the register came into force, and the number of registrations went up to 5,000 immediately when it started in 2011, and it went slightly up towards the 6,500, 7,000. When the rule came into place in December 2014, the number of registrations jumped, and jumped very fast, very quickly, and up to the close to 12,000, 13,000 organizations. As Matti has mentioned, it continues to rise or sometimes even stagnates because of the quality checks that are being conducted by the Secretariat in terms of the quality of the information in the entry in the Transparency Register. So the conditionality principle had a direct impact on the number of registrants on the number of registrants in the register.
Matti also mentioned that the issue of access under these conditions was confined, if you like, to formal contexts or on the premises of the various EU institutions. That does, it seems to me, make it possible for other meetings to be taking place, if you like, off the premises or in less formal contexts. Do you think that this is a problem in practice?
As I mentioned, the Transparency Register is a tool that policymakers can use for their own protection when they meet lobbyists, and also for lobbyists to show that their interests are valid. If you want to go around the rules, you'll always find a way. For example, if you do want to meet a person outside of the premises of the European Parliament as a lobbyist, you can, but ultimately it's the decision of the policymaker, of the member of the European Parliament or the assistant. They actively choose to meet that person outside of the premises of the Parliament. So ultimately the decision to meet the lobbyists is taken by the policymakers themselves, but it is possible under the current rules to be to meet without being registered. Although I would say it is rather difficult to get members of the European Parliament to leave the Parliament to meet you in the cafe right in front. It would be a lot easier to simply register.
And again, I take it that compliance, again, in this context, is not proactively monitored. Is that right?
So if we're looking, and I want to make the difference. So if we're looking at the monitoring on the quality of the entries, that responsibility falls under the Secretariat. The Secretariat of the Register has that responsibility.
No, I meant in terms of complying with the conditionality principle and the issue of access that we've just been discussing. I take it that is not proactively monitored. Is that right?
Well, right now, because the ethical framework of each European institution is of the responsibility of that European institution. So, for example, if you're talking about the Commission, they do have an ethics body that is consulted by the President when there is the belief that there was a breach or a potential breach of the Code of Conduct for commissioners. And there are sanctions in case of serious breach. Commissioners might be forcefully retired or even lose their pension if they consider there was a serious misconduct. But again, there is no, our assessment is that the system is to a very large degree on the conditionality or on the part of the Code of Conduct would be reactive. It relies on a scandal coming out in the newspaper or by a complaint by an individual or an organization.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Lloyd Russell-Moyle, please.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to be clear what we were talking about just a second ago. So when you say that the register doesn't cover people who are meeting outside of the premises, so if you are a commissioner or a DG, is it the case that your office could book a meeting and you just go around the corner to the Greek restaurant behind the commission and have a meeting? Or are you meaning that if it is booked officially, no matter where it takes place, with commissioners, it would have to be registered? I understand if it's an informal meeting in a restaurant, that doesn't need to be covered. But if it was a formal meeting booked by a lobbyist where they invited a commissioner out, and that was booked by their diary secretary, is that declared by them?
To answer this question fully, I have to make a distinction between two institutions. I think it's very important, this. So one of the conditionalities set is that you cannot enter the European Parliament. You need a badge as a lobbyist to enter the European Parliament, and you cannot enter if you're registered. Now, once you enter the European Parliament, you can meet the people that decide to meet you. In the European Parliament, people might choose to leave the premises. If you're voluntary, there's only an obligation to publish by members of Parliament and have an added role on the legislation. If you're a rapporteur, a shadow rapporteur, or a committee chair, you have the obligation to publish any meeting. You don't have the obligation to meet...
Any meeting, including outside of the building?
You have the obligation to publish any meeting related to the file in which you have that added responsibility. It's not related to whether that occurs in the premises or not, but to enter the premises, you would need a badge.
That's with the Parliament and with the Commission?
For the European Commission, the high level, the rule is no registration, no meeting. So it's independent on whether it happens inside the premises or outside the premises. If you're not registered, you cannot meet commissioners, cabinet members, and director general.
Thank you. I think that was an important clarification for my mind. The institutional agreement covers lobbying of the Commission, Council and Parliament, but other EU institutions, bodies, agencies are encouraged to comply but are not required to do so. We know particularly a lot of the decisions are made at the agency level. So what extent are they complying with this voluntarily? And if they don't, how significant is the impact on the integrity of policy making if they don't comply with it universally?
Well, I can only answer this question partly. So we do know that all of the... some of the other bodies, they have very specific type of work. If you talk about the European Court of Justice or the European Central Bank, etc., and you have a number of decentralized agencies. I believe there's about 30 and other types of bodies. From the information, from what I know, there are two agencies that have their own transparency register. And the reason why they are encouraged and they don't actually participate is actually, again, the legal basis, because it's an agreement between the three main institutions. It's not possible to assess the limitations that not having more of the other institutions and bodies participating. What is the limitations of this? And it's for this reason that we have called for every single body and agency to be included in a lobby lobby legislation.
What are the two that have their own registers?
I believe it's Frontex, and I don't recall the other one. Apologies.
So the European Central Bank, which of course does the regulation and safety checks for national banks and has been pretty detrimental to many banks' businesses in those checks. That has no lobbying register.
So in the past, I personally wrote to every agency a couple of years ago asking them to publish. We did receive quite a lot of around 10 or 11 replies. This was around 5 years ago, saying that they would start publishing the meetings of their director. So in the sense, you see this as a publication of the agenda, but a transparency register governing the interactions between every person in the agency and lobbyists, as far as I know, as two. But of course, they might be publishing meetings of the senior or of the director with lobbyists, but this is not being part of the transparency register.
That's very interesting. I suspect, as you indicated, you would like to see it widened out. The UK lobbying register is meant to complement the release of the information about ministers and senior officials' meetings. Given the more comprehensive scope of the EU register, how is important the release from the Commission, Council and Parliament, senior Parliament members about their meetings? And is there anything that automatically tallies the two up to make sure that they are both accurate, you know, kind of the lobbyist and the release?
So, and at this point, I would like to make the distinction between two, because the transparency register, as I mentioned, is a tool that allows people to understand who they are meeting and who they are engaging with, and to have information if they would like more. If they want to know other policies, they can check. If they want other positions, they can check. When it comes to the publication of meetings, I think it is very important because it allows several points. First, let's say that you're a policymaker. In this case, it's easy to imagine, and you would like to make a reform on a legislation that has been passed a few years ago in the past. If you would want to see which actors have been engaged in the past, you'd be able to see that, because you'd be able to see who had engaged with this type of legislation, with this type of topic, and that you might want to reach out to them. It allows you to give to make a mapping of the potential stakeholders, of the potential people interested in this type of legislation that are able to give you information. Ultimately, this allows a level playing field. Lobbying, in a sense, it's connected to the democratic principle, to the democratic system. It allows people to reach out to their policymakers and say, I have an interest in this policy. This will really impact my life and the impact of my business. My view is this, this, and this. What this allows is that not only those with the largest amount of resources will have the say in a policy that will impact so many others that are much smaller in size or much less resources. So knowing the degree of meetings that you as an individual, as a policymaker, you are able to say, in the last year, I met this, this, and this person. But if you take a systemic approach of all the policymakers and all the individuals involved in drafting the legislation and going step by step, you'd like to be able to see how many people or how many stakeholders were engaged, and what is the level of degree of engagement, and whether you are missing maybe a voice that you would like to hear too. And there's a great example of this. When it was the 2008 financial crisis, it was members of the European Parliament recognizing that they never heard the voice of civil society organizations when it came to financial services. And the publication of meetings created this realization. It was a call by members of Parliament at the time for the financial support of NGOs on this field. And that is direct consequence the creation of Finance Watch, which is a civil society organization working on the field of financial services.
So because often, I mean, I get the advantages that you're talking about in terms of releasing information and recording information so that policymakers themselves can improve their effectiveness, and I buy all that. But in terms of that information linked to the lobbying register, do you see it important that the two are linked, or is it enough that they are just separate releases that are treated separately?
I would say that there should be linked, because from the perspective of the, let's say, a journalist or a citizen or a civil society organization, on anyone that has a special interest on a specific topic, they should be able to see, okay, this specific interest, this organization has met these and these levels of government to discuss this specific topic, because there are many topics they might be engaged with. And this should be linked to how much are they engaged, what is their level of, how large are they in the ability to make influence. So the information needs to be there for not just policymakers, but everyone that is interested in the legislation to be able to understand, to fully understand the picture of the, and how you ultimately come to the outcome of the legislation that is ready.
But there is no link at the moment between the two, so they are separate, and that requires then individuals or yourselves to have to dig in the different registers to try and match them up. And I'm right to say that there's no official body that makes sure that the two registers and the register and the releases are both tallying up. There's no official body that does that. I mean, is the range of people expected to release information wide enough? So it's only senior MEPs and senior commission officials down to DG level, am I right?
Yeah, so Director Generals. So I would say that we would like the people that are engaged, that have an impact on the ultimate outcome of a legislation, and that are meeting lobbyists. So if lobbyists are meeting you as a policymaker, is clearly because they believe that at some point and somehow, to a certain degree, you do have an impact on the outcome. And
so at what level would you go down? You'd include all MEPs? Would you include all commission staff?
I'll give you an easier example. If you meet a member of parliament that has the obligation, but if you meet their assistants, there is no obligation attached. So if you meet the policy advisor of the political group that is directly working on the file and many times helps to draft the amendments, there's no obligation related to that. So the targeting very much goes to the person in the spotlight, which is the MEP, but people that are supporting the work of the member of parliament don't have any rule. And we would like this rule to apply to the people that are supporting that work as well.
So people who support MEPs, and would you say that, I mean, the people who really draft the process is the Commission, like in any government, it's the civil service. So at what level does it go down in the civil service to have to have that requirement? Should it be stagiaires and interns? Should they also have to fulfil the register?
I can say ultimately it's up for each system to decide what is in their system, what is the relevant level that you can go.
From Transparency International's point of view, where would you put that level?
What we have defended in the past was the level of head of unit.
Head of unit, okay. That's useful because it gives us an idea of what level is equivalent. I mean, are there consequences for people who don't release information about meetings with lobbyists? You said at the Commission level there was some consequence of you could lose your pension or be fired. That seems like quite a high level consequence that's probably never or rarely done. Are there any consequences for MEPs or actual consequences that aren't firing and losing your pension?
So for members of parliament, there are fines in place. The largest sanction there can be is a fine of losing your fine on 30 days on
30-day salary.
On their income. So, and it's true that the Commission has so if you would you have the obligation under the Code of Conduct for Commissioners to behave in a way that is not contrary, that does not put in jeopardy the image of the European institutions. You have the obligation to behave responsibly, and if you do not, and breaching the rule of no registration, no meeting would be seen as a breach of the ethical rules, and you could indeed lose your pension rights. You could be forcefully retired. But again, as mentioned, but when it comes to sanction, the sanctions are very weak. So I can give as an example, in the past parliamentary term, in the 5 years of the parliamentary term, there were 21 MEPs that were deemed to have breached the Code of Conduct. So it was considered that they did breach the Code of Conduct. And in no case was there a sanction.
Okay,
applied.
thank you. Yeah, that's useful. Thank you.
Well, on that cheerful note, I think it concludes our session. Vittorio, thank you very much indeed for being the witness on our second panel this morning, and again reiterate my thanks to all of our witnesses today. It's been extremely helpful, and we're grateful for it for the course of our inquiry. Thank you very much indeed. Order, order.
The proceeding has ended. 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 The proceeding has ended.